Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to make the case for why the standing press should be in pretty much everyone's training routines. Let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing. Work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Alright, and when I talk about the standing press, I mean what was historically just called the press. It's called just the press. But if you don't specify that today, people don't understand. When you say the press, they don't know what you're talking about. And that's kind of sad, because originally this was considered to be a staple exercise for generations, and in fact it's largely responsible for the overall shoulder development, upper chest development, and all of that, and a lot of these old school bodybuilders and strongmen way back in the day. And it's a fantastic exercise, and contrary to what a lot of people say, it's not really a counterindicated exercise. There are some experts who say, oh, it has a risk of shoulder impingement. But rather than me cover all of that part, I would direct you guys to go see what Mark Ripito says about that. Because he doesn't have people having these problems, and he trains every single person who he works with on this exercise and has done so for decades now. And he'll break down for you in detail those who are concerned about shoulder impingement. He breaks down in detail with anatomy charts on his channel, on his website, and in his books on why this exercise can't cause shoulder impingement if you do it correctly. So I would definitely check that out for those who really care about that and believe that's the case. Now, a lot of people will say, well, I don't know, I don't think it's that good, it just works the front delts, which really isn't true. It's not true at all, and I consider it an essential exercise. Now, what I want to break down for you guys here is more of why I think it needs to be done standing rather than seated. Because what we know based upon the data is not just about the front delt and the side delt. The data I've seen on it shows that it works the rear delt and the triceps more. There's even EMG data showing that when you do this exercise standing and you do it correctly, because it allows the bar path to go differently when you're standing, because you can pull yourself in front of it more, and because you're not sitting up against a backrest, turning it into pretty much a high incline, it allows for a lot more recruitment of the posterior head of the delt and the triceps, right? And these are muscles that get neglected a lot, particularly when you think about the long head of the tricep that gets neglected a lot on a lot of pressing exercises, so much so that people need to focus on isolating that head, don't they? But the overhead press, because of the angle, works the long head more than most other presses do. And so when you have a variation of it like this, that works the triceps even harder than most other overhead presses, that's an important consideration. And that's the thing, is that if you really want to be strong and get the most out of your training, it's really best to not get caught in this bodybuilder mindset of, well, you know, I'll just isolate those muscles. I don't need my overhead press to work my upper chest. Because that's what I tell people. If you do the exercise full range of motion, it builds your entire shoulder girdle. It does help with the rear delt. It's obviously not the only thing you're going to do for rear delts, but it helps. It's an amazing tricep builder. It works the upper chest, works the core, and it's actually in some ways easier on your lower back than doing it seated. Now, people will again always say, but you know, I don't care about all those. I'll do other exercises. I'll isolate those. But that's really not the good mentality. And why would I say that? Because muscle growth is dependent on the accumulation of work that you do. It's based on the accumulation of work that you do. And we don't have any studies that show that isolation movements are superior to compound. So if you can pick a compound movement that gives you additional work in areas that you want to bring up, and let's be realistic here, who is ever happy with their upper chest or their triceps? Who is ever happy with their rear delt development, particularly when we're talking about injury prevention? Rear delt development is one of the biggest problems a lot of lifters and particularly bodybuilders have in terms of risk of shoulder injury. So you should care about these things. And if we can get more work by doing compound movements, it cuts down on the amount of isolation movements you need to do. So in this case, it's not so much about, well, it'll work these two heads of the delt more, the ones that you might be doing a lot of your shoulder work for. It's that it works on just as well, but it works a lot of other stuff with it more effectively. And it's really about getting the most bang for your buck out of an exercise. And again, when you start thinking about the fact that it works the core, works the triceps, works the upper chest, works the rear delts, these are very, very common weak points for people. These are areas that a lot of people go and do a lot of extra isolation work because they're lagging from either a performance or an aesthetic perspective. So when you have an exercise like this that's capable of giving them a respectable amount of additional work, it can cut down on the amount of weak point training you might need to do. And that's an important consideration because at the end of the day, we know that compound movements, based upon all the studies we have, usually build more muscle than isolation. And even when we compare stuff, we start looking at sometimes compound movements that we don't think of as the best movements for a body part. When we look at them in studies, those compounds put as much muscle on people as the best isolation movements do. So again, you have to factor that in. When we have studies that show that the bench press puts as much muscle on your triceps as a tricep extension does, when we have studies showing that lat pull downs tend to build the biceps just as well as a curl, we should be looking for compounds to get this extra work done. If we can find good compound movements to help work these extra muscles, you can cut down on the amount of isolation you need to do. And if you do bother to do the isolation anyways, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know what, if you want to do some rear delt isolation work and some tricep work and all of those things, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you can get a lot of the workload done with a compound, you're going to get better strength out of it. It's going to give you better performance. It's more likely to leave you with fewer of those weak points that you're going to have to work on, and you can possibly cut down the amount of sets that you even need to do. And really at that point, you'll just be thinking of them as just finishing touches or just kind of insurance because you're really worried that muscle's going to need extra work rather than it being a necessity. So picking good compounds like this is helpful. And this particular variation of the exercise gives better development than most other forms of overhead pressing. It allows for a lot of carryover to other muscle groups and oftentimes very neglected muscle groups. Furthermore, when we start talking about injury prevention, the fact that it tends to build a more stable shoulder girdle is a valuable tool. And in fact, that's what a lot of coaches out there have noted, that if they have their bench pressers do a lot of overhead pressing, they tend to get fewer injuries on the bench press in general, even as they get stronger. It seems to create a more stable shoulder girdle. A lot of people will argue that it doesn't carry over to the bench press. There are people who feel it's an amazing accessory for the bench, other people who feel that it doesn't carry over at all. But at the end of the day, if we can bring up those weak areas that cause shoulder stability issues, that becomes valuable if for no other reason than injury prevention, because you want to know the fastest way for your bench press to stall, get hurt. That's a real good way to not improve your bench press for a long time. So it's helpful for that in general. And then when it comes to lower back, what do we know about the seated press? Heavy seated overhead presses are actually more likely to cause issues with your lower back than the standing is if you get the hip and foot position correctly. I'm not saying the overhead press standing can't have risk for lower back. It can actually if you do it wrong. It can. But if you do it correctly, it's actually easier on your lower back and it's a lower chance of injury than doing it seated. And furthermore, it's just simply more athletic. And that's something I think, what's his name, Athlete X, Jeff Cavalier, has done a good job discussing of, look, if you say you want to be more athletic, then do your shoulder presses standing. Do more of your exercises standing, but more importantly, that particular one, you need to be doing it standing. It will give you better carryover to pretty much every sport out there, any sort of field sport you're ever going to compete in. It will be more athletic. And at the end of the day, being more athletic has benefits to other things. Because I promise you, most of you out there, even if you're saying, I'm just training for looks right now, one day you might want to be more physically active and athletic. You might take up tennis. You might take up golf. You might take up something else that is not related to just how your physique looks. And if you've trained in a way using lifts like this that are just a little more athletic, give a little better carryover to other things than a lot of the more traditional, well, this is more traditional, the more current sort of bodybuilding training. If you're going to get the same amount of muscle but you get a little more athleticism, that can be worth it in the long run. So that's why I think that this particular exercise is one that most people need to be doing, and you don't have an excuse not to do it. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.